The string quartet was playing the Valdi Spring just 3 floors below, but all Meline could hear was the ragged, wet sound of her own breathing. She pressed her bruised spine against the cold marble of the bathroom door, clutching a cracked iPhone with trembling, blood-stained fingers. The brass lock rattled violently in its casing. He was outside in a sprawling estate full of high society elites celebrating her sister's wedding. There was not a single soul she could trust to save her except for a man whose name was only whispered in federal indictments. As the heavy mahogany door began to splinter, she pressed call. "Gabriel," she choked out, sliding to the floor. "Can you come get me?" The phone slipped from her slick grip, clattering against the pristine white tiles just as the door frame exploded inward. Wood shards rained down like jagged confetti, scattering across the expensive mosaic floor. Richard stood in the ruined threshold, his tailored tuxedo jacket discarded, his silk bow tie hanging loose around his neck. His face, the handsome, charismatic mask that charmed Wall Street investors and graced magazine covers, was twisted into a grotesque snarl. "Who are you calling, Maddie?" he hissed, his voice a chillingly calm contrast to the violence of his entry. Meline scrambled backward, her expensive champagne silk gown tearing against the sharp edges of the broken door frame, but there was nowhere left to run. Her back hit the glass wall of the walk-in shower. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, trying to disappear into the cold marble exactly as she had done for the last 3 years. "No one," she sobbed, crossing her arms over her ribs where the yellowing bruises from his last rage still throbbed. "Please, Richard. Sarah is cutting the cake soon. You cannot do this here." "I can do whatever I want," he mocked, stepping slowly into the bathroom. The heavy thud of his patent leather shoes echoed against the walls, sounding like a death knell in the enclosed space. "I own this estate. I own the people downstairs. And I own you." He lunged forward with terrifying speed. His large hand clamped into the elaborate updo of her hair, tearing the diamond pins loose and dragging her upward. Meline cried out, the sharp pain blinding her for a second, but she forced herself not to fight back, knowing that resistance only fed his monstrous ego. Through the blurred haze of her tears, she saw the cracked screen of her phone lying near the vanity. The call timer was still ticking. 1 minute and 12 seconds. Gabriel was still on the line. The ruthless boss of the Costa Syndicate was listening to the horror she lived every single day. "You humiliated me," Richard spat, his spittle hitting her cheek as he slammed her shoulders against the marble vanity. Looking at that waiter like he was actually a human being. Like you wanted him to save you. His free hand wrapped around her throat, cutting off her air supply. Meline gasped, her hands weakly clawing at his iron grip. Black spots began to dance at the edges of her vision. Below them, the faint, joyous applause of the wedding guests drifted up through the floorboards. A sickening reminder of the perfect illusion Richard maintained. He squeezed harder, his thumb pressing into her windpipe. "You think anyone cares about you?" he whispered, leaning in so close she could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You are nothing without me. You are a broken, useless thing I dress up for the cameras." She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the agonizing burn in her lungs, praying for the darkness to take her, praying that the man with the cold, dark eyes and the dangerous reputation had heard her plea. She remembered the sheer power radiating from Gabriel Costa 3 months ago at the charity gala, the way he had effortlessly stopped Richard from striking her, the way he had slipped that black card into her hand while whispering a promise of sanctuary. He was a criminal, a man who dealt in blood and shadow, yet he was the only person who had ever looked at her and seen a woman instead of a possession. Richard shook her violently, knocking her skull against the mirror. The glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern behind her head. "Answer me when I speak to you," Richard roared, the charming facade completely gone, leaving only the brutal monster she knew so well. Meline could not breathe, could not speak, but as her vision narrowed to a tunnel, her gaze fell one last time on the glowing screen of her phone on the floor. 2 minutes and 4 seconds. The line was still open. A single tear slipped down her cheek, mixing with the blood from the scratch on her forehead. As her lungs screamed for oxygen and her consciousness began to fade into a heavy, suffocating fog, a sudden, desperate hope flared inside her chest. Gabriel was coming. She just had to survive the next few minutes. She just had to stay alive long enough for the devil himself to arrive and burn her golden cage to ash. 30 miles away from the sprawling Long Island estate, the air inside the subterranean VIP lounge of the Carnegie Club was thick with the scent of aged Cuban cigars and single malt scotch. Gabriel Costa sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, his broad shoulders relaxed in a bespoke charcoal suit that concealed the lethal tension coiled beneath his olive skin. Millions of dollars in contested shipping routes were being violently negotiated, the air vibrating with the silent threats of 5 hardened syndicate bosses. Across the table, a heavily tattooed rival from the Bronx was leaning forward, his voice a low rumble of demands, but Gabriel was barely listening. His dark, unforgiving eyes remained fixed on the ice slowly melting in his crystal glass, a king bored by the pathetic squabbles of lesser men. He was a phantom, a creature of blood and unspeakable violence, ruling a dark empire that demanded absolute, emotionless control. Suddenly, a sharp, generic ringtone pierced the suffocating silence of the underground room. The rival boss stopped speaking mid-sentence, his face draining of color. The hardened killers flanking the table shifted uncomfortably, their hands drifting toward their concealed holsters. No one interrupted Gabriel Costa during a sit-down. No one. Slowly, with a terrifying calm, Gabriel reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and extracted a sleek, unmarked black cell phone. It was his private lifeline, a ghost number that belonged to exactly one person in the entire world. For 3 agonizing months, he had carried this piece of plastic and metal near his heart, waiting for the broken woman from the museum to realize her golden cage was actually a tomb. He raised a single, gloved hand, instantly silencing the breathing of every man in the room, and pressed the phone to his ear. The sound that came through the speaker was not a greeting. It was the horrifying, violent crack of wood splintering, followed by a wet, terrified gasp. Gabriel, her voice choked out, tiny and trembling with an absolute, primal terror that made the blood in his veins turn to liquid nitrogen. "Can you come get me?" A brutal, crashing sound echoed through the line, followed by the muffled, psychotic roaring of Richard Sterling. Something fundamental inside the Mafia boss snapped, the fragile leash he kept on his inner monster disintegrating into ash. Gabriel stood up. The movement was so abrupt, so violently sudden, that his heavy mahogany chair tipped backward and slammed onto the marble floor with a deafening crack. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees in a single second. The rival boss across the table shrank back, instantly paralyzed by the look of pure, unadulterated murder that had just possessed Gabriel Costa's features. "Where are you?" Gabriel asked, his voice a terrifyingly quiet whisper that carried the promise of a slaughter. "Ohika Castle," Meline sobbed, her breath hitching as another heavy blow struck the door hiding her. "Long Island, 3rd floor. He is breaking the door. Gabriel, he is going to kill me." Gabriel's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing groaned under the pressure. "Get into the bathtub," he commanded softly, channeling every ounce of calm he possessed to anchor her terrified soul. "Cover your head. I am coming." He did not say goodbye. He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his jacket, his jaw locked in a rigid line of absolute fury. He did not look at the rival bosses sitting at the table. He did not excuse himself or offer a single word of negotiation regarding the shipping routes. He turned his dark, lethal gaze to his underboss, Mateo, who was already stepping forward, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. "Burn the meeting," Gabriel ordered, his voice echoing off the brick walls with the finality of an executioner. "Call the men. I want every shooter we have outside in 2 minutes. We are going to a wedding." The syndicate bosses sat frozen in sheer disbelief as Gabriel turned his back on a $10 million deal without a second thought. As he strode out of the subterranean club and up the velvet-lined stairs, the cold New York night air hit his face, but he felt nothing. He was a creature forged in violence, a man who had spent his entire life building an empire built on fear and racketeering, and tonight, he was going to unleash every ounce of that hellish power on the golden boy of Manhattan. He slid a custom 9mm Beretta from his shoulder holster, meticulously racking the slide with a sharp, metallic clack as he stepped onto the sidewalk. A fleet of 5 matte black Escalades was already screeching to a halt along the curb, their engines purring aggressively like caged beasts scenting blood. Gabriel slipped into the back of the lead vehicle, his mind completely consumed by the image of Meline's trembling, bruised frame trapped in that bathroom. He was the devil, and Richard Sterling had just made the fatal mistake of threatening the only angel the devil had ever cared to protect. Upstairs in the suffocating confinement of the shattered bridal suite, Meline lay trembling on the cold marble floor, her bleeding fingers wrapped around her knees as Richard's heavy boots paced just inches away. He was ranting, his voice a venomous hiss of promised agony, but suddenly, the lively waltz of the 100-piece orchestra echoing from the grand ballroom 3 floors below came to an abrupt, violent halt. The sudden, unnatural silence that swallowed the sprawling Long Island estate was far more terrifying than the music. Downstairs, the illusion of high society safety had shattered into a million irreparable pieces at exactly 45 minutes past 10. The heavy 12-foot oak doors of the grand ballroom did not simply open. They were violently kicked apart, hitting the gilded walls with a deafening crack that froze the blood of 300 wealthy elites. Sarah Hayes, Meline's younger sister, dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering against the polished floor as a dozen apex predators in immaculate dark suits flooded the room. These were not mere security guards. They were hardened syndicate enforcers, moving with a terrifying, militaristic precision that paralyzed the state senators and Wall Street titans where they stood. Mateo, Gabriel's lead enforcer, secured the main exits with a cold, mechanical efficiency, locking the heavy brass deadbolts and trapping the most powerful families in New York inside a golden cage of their own making. The scent of wilting white roses and expensive French perfume was instantly swallowed by the metallic tang of impending violence. Then, Gabriel Costa walked into the ballroom. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate stride of a dark king stepping onto conquered earth, his bespoke charcoal suit absorbing the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. The silence in the room became absolute, suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy sound of Gabriel's leather shoes striking the marble. He stopped in the exact center of the dance floor, his dark, murderous eyes sweeping over the trembling crowd like a scythe. He saw the corrupt politicians, the arrogant heirs, and the ignorant socialites who had feasted and danced while the woman he intended to claim was being tortured just a few floors above their oblivious heads. His jaw locked, a muscle ticking violently beneath his olive skin. As the phantom scent of Meline's fear seemed to bleed through the very ceiling. For 3 months, he had waited for her call, giving her the space to choose her own rescue, but the thought of her bruised and bleeding skin drove a primal, feral rage deep into his marrow. "Where is Richard Sterling?" Gabriel asked. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, gravelly baritone, yet it carried effortlessly across the breathless room, vibrating with a lethal intent that made the groom's father visibly shake. At the front of the ballroom, near the towering wedding cake, 2 large men wearing discreet earpieces stepped forward. They were Richard's personal security detail, highly paid mercenaries trained to handle corporate threats. But as their hands reached instinctively for their concealed weapons, Mateo and another syndicate enforcer materialized beside them like ghosts. It was a blur of brutal, perfectly executed violence. A sickening crunch of bone echoed through the silent room, followed by a choked gasp, and both bodyguards collapsed to the polished floor, unconscious and bleeding, in less than 5 seconds. Several women in designer gowns covered their mouths to stifle their terrified screams, but not a single guest dared to take a step. Gabriel did not even glance at the fallen men. He kept his dark, abyssal gaze fixed on the trembling crowd, radiating a chaotic, violent energy that promised absolute destruction if his demand was not met. He could feel Meline's terror radiating through the floors above, a desperate, silent plea pulling him forward. "I will not ask again," Gabriel whispered, the quiet menace in his tone freezing the air in the room. He looked directly at a powerful state judge who had golfed with Richard just a week prior. The judge turned the color of ash, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of a linen-draped table to remain standing. He went upstairs, the judge stammered, his voice cracking with primal terror as he pointed a shaking finger toward the grand sweeping staircase in the foyer. "With Meline. 3rd floor." The mention of her name from the lips of a man who had enabled Richard's empire made Gabriel's blood run cold. He did not wait for further explanation. He did not offer a single word of reassurance to the paralyzed wedding guests who had turned a blind eye to a monster. He simply turned on his heel and strode out of the ballroom, his heavy footsteps echoing with the promise of slaughter. Matteo and 3 heavily armed men fell into step close behind him, leaving the 300 elite guests locked in the ballroom, held hostage by the mere presence of the syndicate's shadows. As Gabriel took the grand marble stairs 2 at a time, his hands perfectly steady and his custom beretta resting heavily in its holster, he swore a silent, brutal oath to the dark gods he served. Richard Sterling was about to learn that there were monsters in this world far more terrifying than a billionaire with a god complex, and the devil himself was coming to collect. On the 3rd floor of the sprawling Long Island estate, the muffled sounds of the extravagant wedding reception had been entirely replaced by a horrifying, rhythmic thud. Richard Sterling was throwing his entire body weight against the splintering mahogany door of the master bathroom, his bespoke tuxedo jacket discarded, his knuckles split and bleeding from the sheer force of his rage. Inside the cold, darkened marble bathroom, Meline huddled in the dry porcelain bathtub, her hands pressed desperately over her ears. She was trembling violently, her beautiful champagne silk gown torn at the shoulder, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the heavy brass deadbolt groaned under another vicious kick. "You think you can embarrass me, Maddie?" Richard screamed, his voice vibrating through the cracked wood with psychotic fury. "I am going to break every bone in your hands. I am going to ruin you." Meline squeezed her eyes shut, a violent sob ripping through her bruised ribs. She clutched the cracked burner phone to her chest, praying to a god she had almost stopped believing in that Gabriel Costa had hurt her. Outside the door, the temperature in the long corridor seemed to plummet into freezing oblivion. Richard took 3 steps back to deliver a final, shattering kick, but the blow never landed. The air grew suffocatingly thin. Richard spun around, panting heavily, and froze. Standing 10 feet away, flanked by 4 massive men wielding suppressed weapons, was Gabriel Costa. For a fraction of a second, Richard's arrogant billionaire brain simply could not process the nightmare standing in front of him. Gabriel did not wear a mask, nor did he hold a weapon. He simply stood there in his immaculate charcoal suit, radiating a lethal, simmering fury that seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the corridor. "Costa," Richard panted, quickly trying to paste his charming, philanthropic businessman smile back onto his sweating, red face. "What the hell are you doing here? This is a private." Gabriel closed the distance before Richard could finish his pathetic sentence. He did not yell. He did not throw a punch. Gabriel simply shot his massive, gloved hand forward and wrapped his long fingers around Richard's throat, lifting the billionaire inches off the carpeted floor. With the unstoppable force of a freight train, Gabriel slammed Richard backward into the velvet-lined wall. The impact knocked the breath from Richard's lungs, his expensive loafers kicking wildly in the air as Gabriel crushed his windpipe. "I warned you, Richard," Gabriel whispered, leaning in so close that only the suffocating billionaire could hear the absolute promise of death vibrating in his low, gravelly baritone. "I told you to let her breathe." With a flick of his wrist, Gabriel effortlessly tossed Richard to the side like a discarded piece of garbage. Richard crashed into a delicate antique side table, shattering the wood into pieces, and lay on the floor gasping for air. Matteo, Gabriel's massive enforcer, immediately stepped forward, placing the heavy heel of his combat boot firmly onto Richard's chest, pinning the billionaire to the carpet. Gabriel did not spare the bleeding man another glance. He turned his attention to the ruined, splintered bathroom door, taking a slow, deep breath to steady the murderous aura rolling off his shoulders. When he stepped up to the wood, his entire demeanor shifted, instantly transforming from a ruthless syndicate predator into something impossibly gentle. "Meline," Gabriel murmured, his voice softening into a low, rumbling lullaby that seeped through the cracks in the door. "It is Gabriel. I am here. You can open the door." Inside the tub, Meline froze. The low, gravelly sound of his voice cut through her absolute terror like a beacon of light in a pitch-black room. Her trembling hands reached up, her bloody fingers fumbling with the broken brass lock. The heavy door clicked and swung open a few inches. Gabriel slowly pushed it aside, his dark eyes instantly finding her huddled form. When he saw her, the torn silk dress, her hair ripped from its pins, the blood trickling down her pale temple, something fundamental inside the Mafia boss completely snapped. The hardened men standing behind him took a collective step back, feeling the terrifying, chaotic energy radiating from their leader. Gabriel kept his eyes locked on Meline, but his command to his underboss was absolute. "Matteo," Gabriel said softly. "Break his arms. Both of them." As the sickening, wet crunch of bone and Richard's muffled, agonizing screams echoed down the corridor, Gabriel slowly sank to his knees beside the cold porcelain tub. He slipped off his tailored suit jacket and, with a reverence reserved for holy things, draped the warm, heavy fabric over Meline's violently shaking shoulders. "You are safe now," Gabriel whispered, scooping her small, battered frame into his arms as if she weighed absolutely nothing. Meline buried her face into his chest, her bruised fingers clutching the crisp fabric of his shirt as she finally allowed herself to weep. Gabriel stood, holding her securely against his heart, his dark eyes promising a retribution that would burn the city to ashes. "I have got you," he murmured into her hair as he carried her away from the nightmare. "And he will never, ever touch you again." The matte black Escalade swallowed the miles between Long Island and Manhattan in a heavy, insulated silence. Meline sat trembling in the expansive back seat, drowning in the folds of Gabriel's charcoal suit jacket, the fabric still radiating his intense body heat and the faint, intoxicating scent of cedar and gun oil. Outside the tinted bulletproof glass, the blurred neon lights of the city bled through the rain, but inside the armored cabin, the only sound was the ragged, uneven rhythm of her own shattered breathing. Gabriel sat beside her, a solid wall of pure, terrifying stillness. He did not press her for answers, did not demand gratitude, and did not overwhelm her with hollow comforts. He simply kept his large, warm hand resting inches from hers on the leather seat, a silent, unmovable anchor keeping her from floating away into the dark abyss of her trauma. It took exactly 45 minutes to reach Sutton Place, where the vehicle glided down a hidden, subterranean ramp that sealed shut like the vault of a bank. Meline shrank back into the leather as the doors opened, but Gabriel moved with quiet, deliberate care. He did not wait for his men. He leaned into the cabin and scooped her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her broken body past a dozen heavily armed guards who lowered their eyes the moment their boss stepped onto the polished concrete. The private elevator whisked them upward in complete silence, opening directly into a sprawling, multi-level penthouse that looked less like a home and more like a minimalist, impenetrable fortress. Floor to ceiling. Windows overlooked the churning East River, the stark modern decor bathed in shadows and cold moonlight. Gabriel carried her straight into a massive guest suite, laying her gently atop a king-sized bed covered in immaculate white silk. "The doctor is already here," Gabriel murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "He is one of mine. He will not speak a word of this to anyone." A moment later, an older man with silver hair and a worn leather medical bag entered the room, his demeanor purely clinical and utterly discreet. Meline flinched instinctively as the doctor approached, her entire body tensing in anticipation of pain. Gabriel immediately raised a hand, stopping the physician in his tracks. "Do not rush her," Gabriel commanded softly, his dark eyes locked entirely on Meline's terrified face. "Tell her exactly what you are going to do before you do it." The doctor nodded respectfully and began his meticulous work. As the ruined champagne silk of her gown was carefully cut away, the true extent of Richard's savagery was laid bare under the harsh bedroom lights. Meline squeezed her eyes shut, humiliated by the canvas of dark purple and sickening yellow blooming across her ribs, her shoulders, and her delicate collarbone. She had spent years hiding these marks beneath designer dresses and forced smiles, playing the perfect billionaire wife while dying inside. She heard a sharp, dangerous intake of breath from the corner of the room where Gabriel stood. When she dared to open her eyes, she saw the Mafia boss gripping the edge of a mahogany dresser, so tightly that the heavy wood was audibly groaning under the pressure. His jaw was clenched tight enough to shatter teeth, his abyssal eyes burning with a violent, unrestrained hellfire that promised rivers of blood. Yet, when he looked at her, the monster instantly retreated, replaced by a fierce, undeniable devotion. The doctor worked with practiced efficiency, taping her 3 fractured ribs, applying soothing salves to her split skin, and wrapping her bruised wrists in soft, white bandages. Every touch made her flinch, but Gabriel remained a steady presence, his low voice guiding her through the panic, anchoring her to the present moment. "You are doing perfectly," he whispered, stepping closer to hand her a glass of cool water and a small white pill for the agonizing pain. "He will never lay another finger on you, Meline. I swear it on my life." When the doctor finally finished and quietly excused himself from the penthouse, Meline was left wearing a soft, oversized cotton shirt that Gabriel had gently pulled over her bandaged frame. The heavy painkillers were beginning to pull her into a hazy, dreamless fog, but her mind still raced with the impossible reality of her situation. She had traded the gilded cage of a socially acceptable monster for the shadow-filled fortress of a man whose name made the entire city tremble. Gabriel stepped to the side of the bed, reaching down to pull the thick duvet over her trembling shoulders. His knuckles grazed her uninjured cheek, his touch impossibly light, as if she were made of spun glass. "Sleep," he commanded softly, the dangerous edge completely gone from his tone. "I will be right outside this door. Nothing gets through me." For the first time in 3 agonizing years, Meline let her eyes close, sinking into the soft mattress, protected by the very devil himself. Morning sunlight filtered through the heavy blackout curtains of the Sutton Place penthouse, casting a muted golden glow across the vast, immaculate expanse of the guest suite. Meline stirred, her consciousness surfacing slowly from the thick, dreamless fog of the heavy painkillers flowing through her system. For a fleeting, disorienting second, the soft, suffocating luxury of the Egyptian cotton sheets confused her fragile senses. Then, the dull, relentless throbbing ache radiating from her meticulously taped ribs anchored her violently back to reality. She was not in the cold, cavernous estate on Long Island. She was not trapped behind a splintered mahogany door waiting for the next brutal blow to fall. She was wrapped securely within Gabriel Costas' dark, protective shadow. She carefully pushed herself up against the plush velvet headboard, wincing sharply as her bruised collarbone and battered shoulders protested the simple movement. Across the massive room, sitting in a dark leather wingback chair that looked out over the churning, gray waters of the East River, was Gabriel. He had removed his bespoke suit jacket, his crisp white shirt rolled up at the forearms to reveal the dark, intricate ink of syndicate tattoos tracing the powerful, lethal lines of his muscles. He was watching her with an intense, unwavering focus that made the breath catch painfully in her throat, holding a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee that filled the sterile, clinical room with a rich, roasted warmth. "You slept for 14 hours, Gabriel murmured, his low, gravelly baritone carrying across the silent space like a physical caress. He stood up, moving with that terrifyingly silent grace of an apex predator, and set the heavy mug on the mahogany nightstand beside her. "The doctor said you will need at least 3 weeks of absolute rest for the fractures to heal properly. You are not to move unless absolutely necessary." Meline looked up at him, her beautiful, deeply bruised face impossibly pale and fragile against the stark white pillows. The sheer, staggering magnitude of what he had done for her began to sink into her aching bones. He had abandoned a $10 million syndicate negotiation, stormed a high society wedding with dozens of heavily armed enforcers, and mercilessly crippled a billionaire, all to pull her from a living nightmare. She opened her mouth to thank him, to pour out the overwhelming, desperate gratitude swelling in her chest, but the words died instantly in her throat as a sickening, icy realization crashed over her. Her hazel eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing panic. "Sarah," she gasped, her hands trembling so violently that the heavy down duvet slipped from her bruised shoulders. "Gabriel, my sister." Sarah was at the wedding downstairs. "Richard will use her. He will hurt her to punish me." The horrifying memory of Richard's psychotic rage flooded her mind, the way he had always promised to break everything she loved if she ever dared to step out of line. She tried to throw her bare legs over the edge of the mattress, a sharp, ragged cry escaping her split lips as her fractured ribs screamed in sheer agony. Gabriel was there. In a fraction of a second, his large, warm hands gently but firmly pressing her shaking shoulders back into the soft pillows. "Do not move, Meline," he commanded, his tone softening into a fierce, protective rumble that vibrated against her skin. "Your sister is perfectly safe." He carefully adjusted the thick blankets around her shivering frame, his dark, abyssal eyes locking onto hers with an unwavering, absolute certainty that demanded her complete trust. The very moment we left the estate, Matteo dispatched a heavily armed extraction team to secure Sarah. She is currently resting in an impenetrable safe house in upstate New York, guarded by 12 of my most lethal, trusted men. Richard Sterling will never get within 100 miles of her. Meline let out a ragged, tearing sob of pure relief, her bruised fingers weakly clutching at the crisp fabric of his shirt. The familiar, intoxicating scent of cedar and gunpowder wrapped around her, grounding her racing, terrified heart. But as she looked up into Gabriel's shadowed, handsome face, she saw the grim, hardened lines of a man preparing for an absolute slaughter. "You started a massive war for me," she whispered, the horrifying weight of the truth crushing her lungs. "Richard will not stop. He owns state judges. He owns the police commissioners. He will burn the entire city down to ash just to drag me back to that golden cage." Gabriel reached out, his rough thumb lightly brushing a stray, hot tear from her bruised cheek with an agonizing, reverent tenderness. The sheer contrast between his violent, bloody reputation and the gentle devotion of his touch made her battered heart ache. "Let him try," Gabriel replied, a cold, terrifying smile ghosting across his lips as his eyes darkened with the promise of pure violence. "Richard Sterling thinks his inherited money makes him a god among men. He thinks he can simply buy the air you breathe and the ground you walk on. But he has never actually faced the devil in the dark." Gabriel leaned closer, the raw, undeniable power of the criminal underworld radiating from every inch of his formidable being. "This is no longer his city, Meline. I have mobilized every syndicate enforcer from Brooklyn to Queens. We are already bleeding his offshore shell companies dry. We are systematically cutting off his supply lines and silencing his political puppets. By the time this conflict is over, Richard will have absolutely nothing left, and he will know exactly what it feels like to be completely broken and utterly helpless." Meline stared at the beautiful, terrifying monster who had claimed her as his own, realizing that her desperate, whispered plea for rescue had ignited a massive, violent conflict that would consume everything in its path. Yet, as Gabriel Costa sat beside her bedside, promising to mercilessly destroy the very foundations of her abuser's empire, she felt something she had not felt in 3 agonizing years. She felt completely, undeniably safe. The massive flat-screen television mounted on the concrete wall of the Sutton Place penthouse cast a cold, flickering blue light across the darkened bedroom. Meline sat perfectly still against the plush white pillows, her bandaged ribs aching with a dull, persistent throb as she stared at the high-definition broadcast playing on the local news channel. Richard Sterling stood at a podium bathed in the harsh glare of a dozen press cameras, looking every inch the tragically broken husband. Both of his arms were encased in thick, white plaster casts and supported by heavy medical slings, a direct result of Gabriel's ruthless retribution just 48 hours prior. But it was not his injuries that made the blood freeze in Meline's veins. It was his performance. Richard was weeping, his handsome, charismatic face twisted into a mask of perfect, manufactured agony as he stared directly into the camera lenses. He spoke with a trembling voice, weaving a horrifying, fabricated tale for the entire city to consume. He told the reporters that a violent, organized crime syndicate had stormed a joyous family celebration and ruthlessly kidnapped his beloved wife. He called Gabriel Costa a monster, a shadow who had ripped the light from his life, and then, with tears streaming down his bruised cheeks, Richard offered a staggering $10 million reward for Meline's safe return. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of that number echoed through the silent penthouse suite. $10 million was not just a bounty. It was an open invitation to every corrupt police officer, desperate bounty hunter, an ambitious street thug in New York to hunt her down and drag her back to the man who had promised to break every bone in her hands. Meline's breath hitched, a wave of primal panic threatening to pull her back into the dark, suffocating abyss of her trauma. But before the terror could completely take hold, the heavy oak door of the bedroom pushed open, and the scent of expensive cedar and gun oil rolled into the room. Gabriel stepped into the flickering blue light, his jaw locked in a rigid line of absolute fury as he watched Richard's televised lies. He wore a crisp black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the lethal tension in his tattooed forearms. The air around him practically vibrated with a dark, murderous energy, a silent promise that he was going to rip Richard's tongue from his throat. He looked away from the screen and locked his deep, abyssal eyes on Meline, his expression softening instantly into fierce, unwavering devotion. "He is a dead man walking," Gabriel murmured, his low, gravelly voice washing over her like a protective shield. "I am going to tear his empire apart piece by piece, and then I am going to bury him where no one will ever find him." Meline looked into the eyes of the devil who had saved her, seeing the absolute, terrifying truth in his vow. He was willing to burn the entire world to ash just to keep her safe. For 3 agonizing years, she had survived by making herself small, by disappearing into the background and letting Richard's cruelty wash over her. But looking at Gabriel, feeling the raw, undeniable safety of his presence, something fractured deep within her soul. The fragile, terrified victim she had been was slowly disintegrating, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. She refused to be a passive prisoner in this war. She refused to let Gabriel carry the entire burden of her salvation while Richard weaponized his wealth and influence against them. "He hides behind his money," Meline whispered, her voice surprisingly steady as she pulled the heavy down duvet away from her battered legs. Gabriel crossed the room in a single, fluid motion, sitting on the edge of the mattress and gently resting his large, warm hand over hers to stop her from moving. "You need to rest, Meline," he commanded softly, his thumb tracing the soft skin of her knuckles. Meline shook her head, her hazel eyes completely devoid of fear. "No, Gabriel. You want to tear his empire apart. I know exactly where you need to start." She took a slow, painful breath, letting the dull ache in her ribs fuel her determination. "For 3 years, I was invisible to him. He thought I was just a stupid, broken doll. He took phone calls in front of me, held private meetings while I poured his scotch, because he believed I was too terrified to ever speak." Gabriel went perfectly still, his predatory instincts instantly catching the shift in her demeanor. He leaned closer, giving her his absolute, undivided attention. "There is a shipping terminal in Brooklyn," Meline continued, her voice gaining a hard, sharp edge. "Pier 42. It is registered under a shell corporation, but Richard owns it completely. He uses it to funnel illegal weapons and untraceable cash for the Volkov syndicate. The Russians use his legitimate shipping containers to bypass customs, and Richard takes a 30% cut." Gabriel's dark eyes widened marginally, the sheer magnitude of what she was giving him clicking into place. The Volkov syndicate was ruthless, but they demanded absolute secrecy. If their operation was exposed, they would not blame the authorities. They would blame Richard. "He keeps a secondary ledger," Meline whispered, leaning closer to the dangerous man who had shattered her golden cage. "It is hidden in a floor safe inside the terminal's main office. The code is my birth date. If you take that terminal, if you expose that ledger, the Russians will destroy him before you even have to fire a single shot." A slow, terrifying smile spread across Gabriel Costa's handsome face. He looked at the battered, beautiful woman sitting in his bed, no longer seeing a fragile victim, but a lethal, calculating queen ready to claim her throne in the shadows. He lifted her hand, pressing a reverent, searing kiss to her bandaged wrist. "We are going to burn him to the ground, Meline," Gabriel promised, his voice a dark, beautiful symphony of impending ruin. "And we are going to start tonight." Gabriel's dark eyes locked onto Meline's, reflecting the neon glow of the muted television screen. He did not see a broken billionaire's wife anymore. He saw a weapon forged in the fires of a 3-year domestic hell. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the ragged intake of her own breath as the heavy painkillers waged a losing war against her fractured ribs. "You are sure about the safe?" Gabriel asked, his gravelly voice dropping to a lethal whisper that vibrated against the cold marble floors. "I am sure," Meline replied, her gaze unwavering despite the dull throbbing in her skull. She remembered the suffocating terror of standing barefoot in Richard's study, watching him input the code, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the coppery taste of blood in her own mouth. "He uses my birthday. September 12th. He thinks it is romantic." Gabriel let out a low, dark sound that was half chuckle and half snarl. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently cupping her uninjured cheek. The contrast between his devastating reputation and the infinite care in his touch made her bruised heart flutter wildly against her taped chest. "Then we take the ledger," he commanded softly. "And we make the Volkov syndicate do our dirty work." He carefully helped her sit up, his strong arm supporting her back so the strain on her ribs was minimal. He draped his heavy cashmere coat over her shoulders, the fabric instantly wrapping her in warmth and the intoxicating scent of cedar and gunpowder. He led her out of the guest suite, guiding her slow, agonizing steps down the long, shadowed corridor of the seven-place fortress. They bypassed the lavish living areas and approached a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. Gabriel pressed his thumb to a glowing biometric scanner, and the thick metal hissed open to reveal the nerve center of his empire. The war room was bathed in the harsh, blue light of dozens of massive monitors, displaying live feeds of shipping routes, financial grids, and security cameras from across the city. The air smelled sharply of bitter espresso and heated electronics. 3 heavily armed men in immaculate dark suits stood around a polished mahogany table, but they instantly fell silent and lowered their eyes to the floor the moment Meline stepped into the room. Gabriel pulled out a plush leather chair for her, waiting until she was safely seated before he turned his attention to his men. "Bring up the blueprints for Pier 42, he ordered, his tone shifting from gentle protector to absolute commander. Meline watched him, mesmerized by the sheer, terrifying authority he wielded. For years, she had been entirely invisible, a pretty, fragile ornament to be paraded around and punished in secret. But sitting in this cold, concrete room surrounded by lethal men, she was no longer a victim. Gabriel pulled a chair close to hers, their knees brushing under the heavy table. He spread a series of digital maps across the screen, his dark, tattooed fingers tracing the perimeter of the Brooklyn terminal. "The Volkovs keep their untraceable cash in this sector," he explained, looking directly at Meline for confirmation instead of his lieutenants. "But Richard's office is here." Meline leaned forward, ignoring the sharp sting in her collarbone. She pointed to a secondary structure on the glowing blueprint. "The safe is not in the main office," she corrected, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "It is beneath the floorboards in the private lounge attached to the loading bay. He moves the money there during the shift changes so the dock workers never see the transfer." The 3 enforcers exchanged surprised glances, clearly stunned by the precise, invaluable intel coming from the bruised woman in the oversized shirt. Gabriel simply smiled, a proud, dangerous expression that made the air in the room grow suffocatingly thin. "You heard the lady," Gabriel growled softly, leaning back in his leather chair. "We bypassed the main office completely. We hit the lounge at midnight, extract the ledger, and clean out the Volkov money." Meline looked down at her small, trembling hands, her knuckles still blue from where she had tried to block Richard's blows. She took a deep, shuddering breath, feeling the fear that had dictated her entire life finally begin to melt away, replaced by a cold, searing thirst for retribution. She was going to help them burn her abuser to the ground, and she was going to do it standing right beside the most dangerous man in New York. The harsh, flickering blue light of the war room monitors washed over the massive, polished mahogany table, casting long, sharp shadows across the scattered architectural blueprints of Pier 42. Meline leaned forward with extreme caution, forcing herself to ignore the dull, persistent ache radiating from her tightly taped ribs. Her hazel eyes tracked the digitized, sweeping patrol routes of Richard's private security forces on the glowing screen. Gabriel stood intimately close behind her, so close that the intense, solid heat of his massive frame seeped easily through her oversized cotton shirt, anchoring her racing heart to the terrifying reality of what they were about to execute. "Richard runs 3 separate guard shifts," Meline murmured, her voice miraculously steadying as she tapped a perfectly manicured, though deeply bruised, finger against the glowing schematic of the commercial loading bay. "The Volkov syndicate cash is moved exclusively during the midnight rotation, precisely when the Union dock foremen are cleared out and only his hand-picked, untraceable mercenaries remain." Gabriel leaned over her right shoulder, planting his large, heavily tattooed hands on the cold table on either side of her, effectively caging her within the intoxicating, masculine scent of dark cedar, expensive espresso, and simmering violence. "How many men are we looking at?" Gabriel asked, his deep, gravelly baritone rumbling directly against her ear, sending a sudden, electric shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with her lingering fear. "Usually 12, Meline answered without a second of hesitation, pulling the exact tactical memories from the dark corners of her mind where she had filed away 3 long years of forced, silent observation. For at the main perimeter gate, 2 patrolling the chain-link fence line, and 6 stationed directly outside the private, soundproof lounge where the hidden floor safe is located. Matteo, Gabriel's imposing, battle-scarred underboss, crossed his massive arms across his broad chest, staring at the flashing screens with cold, calculating eyes. "If we hit the terminal hard and slaughter his mercenaries, the Volkovs will know it was a rival Italian syndicate," Matteo stated, his voice a low, threatening growl that bounced off the concrete walls. "They will simply write the lost cash off as a cost of doing business and immediately retaliate against our men in Queens." Meline slowly shook her head, a cold, unfamiliar sense of ruthless clarity settling over her battered, exhausted soul. "You do not slaughter them," she corrected gently, looking up to meet Matteo's hardened, skeptical gaze before turning her face slightly to catch Gabriel's dark, predatory eyes. "You have to make it look exactly like Richard orchestrated the theft himself to pay off the $10 million reward he just offered on national television for my return." A slow, wicked, terrifyingly beautiful smile spread across Gabriel's handsome, shadowed face. The sheer, undisguised pride burning in his expression made her breath catch painfully in her bruised throat. "She is entirely right," Gabriel murmured, his rough thumb lightly and reverently brushing the uninjured skin of her bare shoulder. "We disable the terminal security cameras using Richard's own master override codes. Meline knows the exact numeric sequence. We leave the heavily armed mercenaries unharmed but locked inside the main security office, and we empty the hidden floor safe without leaving a single trace of forced entry. The only living person with the private code and the desperate motive to steal that much untraceable Russian cash is Richard Sterling." Meline nodded, her mind working with a sharp, lethal precision that she had suppressed for years just to survive the daily horrors of her golden cage. "He also has a secondary, highly encrypted offshore account in the Cayman Islands," she added, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, devastating whisper. "He uses it to hide slush funds from the federal government." If your hackers can digitally transfer a small fraction of the stolen Russian mob money into that specific account, the Volkov syndicate will inevitably find it. They have ruthless cyber analysts who constantly monitor his ledgers to ensure he is not skimming off the top. When they see their own money sitting quietly in his private reserve, they will not wait for an explanation or a trial. The three heavily armed enforcers standing around the mahogany table stared at the fragile, bruised woman in stunned, absolute silence. They clearly recognized that the billionaire's supposedly broken, battered wife was rapidly becoming the most dangerous, strategic weapon in their entire criminal arsenal. Gabriel did not look surprised, only deeply, profoundly captivated by her brilliant mind. He slowly turned his head, his lips hovering dangerously, tantalizingly close to her pale temple. "You are an absolute revelation, Meline," Gabriel whispered, the raw, unfiltered admiration in his velvet voice wrapping around her fragile heart like a warm, unbreakable vice. He kept a brilliant queen locked away in a glass box, and he was far too arrogant to ever realize she possessed the power to shatter his entire world into a million pieces. For the next 4 grueling hours, they worked seamlessly side by side in the suffocatingly tense atmosphere of the underground war room. Meline provided every encrypted security code, every mercenary shift schedule, and every structural vulnerability she had meticulously memorized. During the countless, lonely nights she had pretended to be invisible in Richard's study, Gabriel drafted the surgical assault with terrifying, military precision, his dark, watchful eyes constantly tracking Meline's pale, exhausted face to ensure she was not pushing her broken body too close to the edge. As the red digital clock on the main monitor ticked past 2 in the morning, the intricate, flawless blueprint for Richard's absolute ruin was finally complete. Gabriel slowly straightened to his full, towering height, the violent, simmering energy of the criminal underworld rolling off his broad shoulders in invisible, suffocating waves. "Matteo," Gabriel commanded, his voice dropping into a lethal, unforgiving register that promised imminent, poetic bloodshed. "Assemble the ghost team. We move on Pier 42 the very moment the heavy fog rolls in from the harbor." He looked down at Meline, his abyssal eyes burning with a dark, romantic promise of absolute, uncompromising vengeance. "It is time to make your monster pay." The thick, oppressive fog rolled off the freezing waters of the East River, blanketing Brooklyn in a heavy, ghostly shroud just as the red digital clock on the war room monitors silently flipped to midnight. Inside the subterranean fortress at Sutton Place, the air was thick with the sharp scent of dark roasted espresso and the quiet, electric hum of high-grade computer servers. Meline sat rigidly in the plush leather chair, her bandaged ribs aching with a dull, rhythmic throb as she stared at the grid of glowing blue screens. Beside her, Gabriel Costa stood like a monument carved from shadow and vengeance, his massive, tailored frame radiating a heat that grounded her trembling hands. On the main monitor, the infrared feeds from Pier 42 flickered, revealing the skeletal outlines of towering shipping cranes and endless rows of stacked metal containers. "The shift change is happening right now," Meline whispered, her voice surprisingly steady as she watched 3 thermal heat signatures moving away from the main perimeter gate. Richard's Union foremen are leaving the terminal. The 12 mercenaries will lock the main gates and rotate to the secondary patrol routes within the next 90 seconds. Gabriel leaned over her, his large, calloused hand resting protectively on the back of her chair. He keyed the secure communication relay linking them to the assault team on the ground. "Matteo," Gabriel commanded, his low, gravelly baritone vibrating against Meline's collarbone. "The perimeter is clear. Move the ghost team in. Leave no trace of forced entry." On the glowing monitors, 12 shadows detached themselves from the dense, swirling fog along the waterfront. They wore pitch-black tactical gear, moving with the terrifying, silent synchronization of true apex predators. Meline held her breath, her hazel eyes tracking the ruthless ballet unfolding on the screen. She had spent 3 agonizing years cowering in the shadows of Richard's immaculate, suffocating mansions, terrified of his unpredictable wrath. Now, she was systematically dismantling his most guarded secrets from the safety of a Mafia king's war room. Camera feed override initiated, a technician murmured from the far side of the concrete room. Looping the footage of the empty loading bay now. Meline watched as Mateo and his men scaled the chain-link fence with impossible speed, slipping past the blind spots she had meticulously mapped out for them. The first two mercenaries patrolling the northern fence line never even saw the darkness coming for them. Gabriel's enforcers dropped from the top of the stacked shipping containers, wrapping thick, gloved arms around the mercenaries' throats and dragging them soundlessly into the black voids between the metal crates. There was no gunfire, no shouting, just the chilling, absolute efficiency of a syndicate that ruled the criminal underworld. Meline squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, the heavy painkillers in her blood making her mind swim, but she forced herself to keep watching. She was no longer a broken doll. She was the architect of her abuser's ruin. "Two down," Gabriel murmured, his dark, watchful eyes flicking from the monitors to Meline's pale face. He reached out, his thumb lightly stroking the uninjured skin of her neck, offering a silent, unwavering comfort. "You are doing perfectly, Meline. Just breathe." She opened her eyes, leaning slightly into his warm, grounding touch as she focused on the infrared feed showing the reinforced lounge building. "There are 4 guards at the main gate, but they are completely isolated from the lounge," Meline instructed, her voice gaining a hard, icy edge of confidence. "The remaining 6 are stationed directly outside the private office. If Mateo's team uses the western ventilation access grate, they can drop into the corridor right behind them." Gabriel relayed the instructions without a single second of hesitation, trusting her intimate knowledge of the terminal. With his men's lives on the screens, the ghost team vanished into the ventilation shafts, moving like phantoms through the industrial ductwork. Minutes later, the heavy grate above the corridor silently gave way. Meline gripped the edge of the mahogany table as 6 of Gabriel's enforcers dropped onto the concrete floor behind Richard's unsuspecting mercenaries. The takedown was a masterclass in brutal, silent warfare. Mateo and his men moved like fluid darkness, disarming and incapacitating the heavily armed guards with precise, non-lethal force. Syringes filled with heavy sedatives flashed briefly in the dim light, plunging into the necks of the mercenaries. Within exactly 45 seconds, all 6 men were unconscious on the cold floor, their weapons stripped and their radios disabled. "The corridor is completely secure," Mateo's deep voice crackled over the encrypted comms, barely a whisper over the sound of the howling wind outside. "We have them neutralized and bound inside the security office. No blood was spilled, just as you ordered." Gabriel smiled, a dark, terrifying expression of pure predatory satisfaction that made the air in the war room feel suffocatingly thin. He looked down at Meline, the raw, unfiltered admiration burning in his abyssal eyes wrapping around her fragile heart like a warm, unbreakable vice. "You did it, Meline," he promised softly, his lips brushing against her temple with a devastating, protective tenderness. "The path to the floor safe is wide open. Now, we take the Russian money, and we leave your monster holding the match." The heavy, soundless atmosphere of the underground war room felt thick enough to cut with a knife as Meline stared at the glowing center monitor. Through the grainy, high-definition night vision feed, she watched Mateo and his ghost team pry the polished mahogany floorboards away from the foundation of Richard's private lounge. Gabriel stood perfectly still behind her chair, his chest a solid, radiating wall of heat against her aching back, his steady breathing the only sound anchoring her to reality. "The digital lock is exposed," Mateo's deep voice crackled over the secure comms, barely a whisper through the encrypted channel. "Inputting the cipher now." Meline closed her eyes for a brief second, reciting the numbers of her own birthday out loud, feeling a sick, twisted poetry in the fact that the date of her birth was about to become the exact moment of her husband's demise. On the screen, the heavy steel hinges of the hidden floor vault hissed open, revealing row upon row of tightly vacuum-sealed $100 bills. "We have eyes on the Volkov Reserve," Mateo confirmed, the cool professionalism in his voice completely masking the staggering reality of what they were looking at. "It looks like $50 million in unmarked, untraceable cash." Gabriel did not even blink at the astronomical figure. He simply rested his large, tattooed hands on Meline's fragile shoulders, his thumbs tracing slow, soothing circles against her collarbone. "Bag the cash," Gabriel ordered softly into the microphone, his gravelly baritone a dark symphony of impending ruin. "But leave the bottom two rows exactly where they are. We need the Russians to know someone was here, and we need them to find what was left behind." Meline leaned forward, her hazel eyes completely locked on the screens as the men in black tactical gear methodically emptied the vault, filling heavy canvas duffel bags with the stolen syndicate money. "Now for the signature," Gabriel murmured, leaning his head down so his lips brushed against Meline's temple, sending a sudden, electric shiver through her exhausted body. "Mateo, access the terminal's mainframe using Richard's personal override keys. I want the digital footprint to scream his name." The technician across the room began typing with a furious, rapid-fire precision, digitally mirroring Mateo's actions on the ground. Meline watched the secondary monitor light up with lines of encrypted code. "I am routing a wire transfer of exactly $500,000 directly from the Volkov accounts into Richard's hidden offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands," the technician announced, his fingers flying across the backlit keyboard. "The Volkov cyber analysts will flag the internal theft within 48 hours. They will trace the IP address straight back to the private router in Richard's penthouse study." Meline felt a cold, sharp breath escape her bruised lips. It was a flawless, devastatingly ruthless frame job. Richard had built his entire pristine, untouchable empire on a foundation of lies and intimidation, and now, that very foundation was being weaponized against him. But Gabriel was not finished. He wanted Richard entirely eradicated from the face of the earth. "Set the delayed federal tripwire," Gabriel commanded, his dark eyes fixed on the live feed of the sprawling terminal. "Richard is hoarding 3 shipping containers full of unregistered automatic weapons and uncut narcotics in Sector 7. The Volkovs use his legitimate shipping manifests to bypass customs." Meline nodded, remembering the hushed, terrified phone calls Richard had taken behind closed doors, bragging about his brilliant smuggling routes. "Once the cash is secured and the team is out," Gabriel continued, his voice dropping into a lethal, unforgiving register, "trigger a silent, anonymous alarm directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Tell them exactly which containers to open. Set the delay for exactly 4 hours. By the time the sun rises, federal agents will be swarming Pier 42, and they will find Richard's personal, digital signature authorizing every single illegal shipment." Meline watched as Mateo and his men zipped the heavy duffel bags shut, leaving the vault partially empty and deliberately compromised. The ghost team moved back into the swirling, dense fog of the Brooklyn harbor, vanishing into the night like smoke, leaving the 12 unconscious mercenaries locked safely inside the security office with absolutely no memory of the intrusion. The red digital clock on the monitor blinked 3 in the morning. The trap was set, spring-loaded, and entirely inescapable. Meline sat back against Gabriel's strong, solid chest, a profound, shuddering relief washing over her battered ribs. The terrifying monster who had kept her locked in a beautiful glass cage for 3 years was going to wake up to a world where he was completely hunted. The federal government would tear apart his legitimate corporations, and the ruthless Russian mob would hunt him down for stealing their money. Richard Sterling was a dead man walking, and he did not even know it yet. Gabriel reached down, gently lifting Meline from the leather chair and pulling her into a warm, protective embrace, mindful of her injuries. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "It is done, my queen," he whispered fiercely against her skin, his heart pounding in rhythm with hers. "His empire is burning, and you are finally free." Morning light filtered through the reinforced, bulletproof glass of the Sutton Place underground war room, but Meline's attention remained entirely and rigidly fixed on the high-definition surveillance feeds lighting up the massive center monitor. She held a warm ceramic mug of chamomile tea, her bruised, pale fingers tracing the smooth edge as Gabriel stood intimately close behind her. His broad, heavily muscled chest was a solid, radiating wall of heat against her aching back, his steady breathing the only sound anchoring her to the surreal, unfolding reality. On the digital screen, Richard Sterling paced the length of his immaculate, glass-walled corporate office high above the sprawling streets of Midtown Manhattan. He looked pristine and perfectly composed in his tailored, imported navy suit, utterly oblivious to the lethal snare that had snapped shut around his ankles just hours ago during the midnight raid at Pier 42. Meline felt Gabriel's heavy, warm hand resting protectively on her shoulder, a silent, powerful anchor as the red digital clock on the bottom of the screen hit exactly 8 in the morning. Suddenly, the live feed from the corporate lobby exploded into frantic, uncoordinated chaos. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets swarmed the pristine reception area, their golden shields gleaming harshly under the bright fluorescent lights as they secured the elevators and exits. Meline held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her tightly taped ribs. She watched Richard's arrogant, untouchable expression shatter into absolute, unfiltered panic as his heavy oak office doors were violently pushed open by the armed task force. Even without an audio feed, Meline could read the chaotic, desperate movements perfectly. The lead federal agent slammed a thick, official warrant directly down onto Richard's pristine glass desk, gesturing sharply toward the rows of filing cabinets. Meline watched her abuser lunge for his secure, encrypted computer terminal, his manicured fingers flying across the backlit keyboard with frantic desperation. He was checking the secondary offshore accounts, finding the exact $500,000 transfer that Gabriel's hackers had planted, the digital footprint that painted the billionaire as a greedy, foolish thief to the most ruthless mobsters in the entire city. Gabriel leaned down, his dark, freshly shaven cheek brushing against Meline's soft hair, engulfing her in the intoxicating scent of expensive cedar and lingering gunpowder. "He sees it," Gabriel murmured, his dark, gravelly voice vibrating with a lethal, deeply poetic satisfaction. "He knows the federal agents are the least of his problems right now. He knows the Russians are already hunting him." On the glowing monitor, Richard stumbled backward, his handsome face draining of all natural color until he looked like a terrified ghost. He shoved past his panicked secretary and sprinted toward the private, executive elevator hidden seamlessly behind a false mahogany bookshelf. Meline swallowed hard, the phantom pain in her fractured ribs flaring as she remembered how many times she had cowered from that same, frantic energy. She watched Richard scramble into the steel box, desperately jabbing the glowing button for the underground parking garage. Matteo, standing silently in the corner of the war room, tapped a single key on the main console, instantly switching the live feed to the dimly lit, concrete basement level of the corporate skyscraper. The silver elevator doors slid smoothly open on the screen. Richard rushed out into the damp parking structure, clearly expecting to find his loyal, heavily armed private driver waiting with the engine running. Instead, four massive, terrifyingly still figures stepped out from the deep shadows of the concrete pillars. They wore heavy, dark leather coats, their faces carved into masks of brutal, unforgiving Russian fury. The Volkov Syndicate enforcers had arrived before the federal agents could even properly secure the lower levels of the building. Meline watched, paralyzed by a potent, overwhelming mixture of residual terror and profound vindication, as the largest Russian enforcer stepped forward and slammed a heavy, ruthless fist directly into Richard's stomach. The billionaire doubled over in silent, breathless agony, his expensive suit tearing against the filthy, oil-stained concrete floor. The enforcers dragged him effortlessly by his polished lapels, tossing him like useless, broken trash into the back of an unmarked, idling black van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, and the van sped away into the busy morning traffic, leaving nothing but an empty, cold garage and a completely shattered empire behind. Meline let out a long, shuddering exhale, her exhausted, battered body slumping back into Gabriel's solid, unyielding strength. The monster who had tormented her, who had locked her in a beautiful, terrifying glass cage for 3 agonizing years, had just been swallowed alive by the deepest, darkest shadows of the criminal underworld. "The king has finally fallen," Gabriel whispered, pressing a fierce, reverent kiss to the crown of her trembling head. "Now, we go to the slaughterhouse and collect his bones." The heavy steel doors of the abandoned meat-packing plant groaned in protest as Gabriel pushed them open, revealing a cavernous, freezing interior that smelled sharply of rusted iron and old blood. Meline stepped into the freezing warehouse, her delicate black heels clicking against the stained concrete floor with a steady, rhythmic confidence she had not possessed 48 hours ago. Gabriel walked beside her, his massive frame radiating a dangerous, predatory heat in the freezing air, his thick arm wrapping securely around her waist to anchor her against the chilling atmosphere. Behind them, Mateo and 6 heavily armed enforcers dragged the heavy canvas duffel bags filled with $50 million in unmarked cash. The cavernous space was illuminated only by harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights hanging from heavy industrial chains. In the center of the kill floor, flanked by 24 heavily armed Russian mercenaries, sat Alexei Volkov. The ruthless syndicate leader rested on a rusted metal barrel, smoking a thick cigar, his cold, pale eyes locking onto Gabriel with a mixture of respect and lethal calculation. But Meline did not look at the Russian boss. Her hazel eyes were drawn immediately to the broken, pathetic figure kneeling on the frozen concrete just a few feet away. Richard Sterling, the billionaire monster who had kept her locked in a suffocating glass cage for 3 agonizing years, was unrecognizable. His custom-tailored navy suit was shredded and soaked in dark, freezing water. His perfectly styled hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and his arrogant face was bruised and swollen into a mask of pure, unfiltered terror. His hands were bound tightly behind his back with thick, industrial zip ties, and he was trembling violently in the freezing air. When Richard lifted his heavy head and saw Meline standing beside the most feared mafia boss in the city, his eyes widened in absolute, staggering disbelief. He opened his mouth, his cracked lips trembling, but no sound came out. Meline stared down at the man who had controlled her every breath, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness where her fear used to live. "Costa," Volkov rumbled, his thick, heavy accent echoing off the metallic walls as he stood up and crushed his cigar beneath a heavy leather boot. "You brought the missing funds." Gabriel did not flinch, his abyssal eyes holding the Russian's gaze with absolute, unyielding dominance. "Every single dollar your rat tried to steal, Alexei," Gabriel replied, his gravelly baritone vibrating in the freezing air. Mateo stepped forward, dropping the heavy canvas bags onto the blood-stained concrete. Volkov gestured to his men, and 2 mercenaries immediately knelt to inspect the cash, nodding their confirmation to their boss. Volkov smiled, a terrifying, cold expression that made the room feel even more suffocating. "It seems Mr. Sterling was a very foolish man," Volkov sneered, walking slowly around Richard's trembling form. "He thought he could use my shipping routes, steal my cash, and run to his little offshore islands." Richard let out a pathetic, desperate sob, his eyes darting frantically from the Russian boss to Meline. "Meline," Richard choked out, his voice hoarse and broken. "Meline, please. Tell them. Tell them I did not do this. You know me." Meline did not move. She felt Gabriel's thumb stroke a slow, comforting circle against the curve of her hip, grounding her completely in the present moment. She looked at Richard, seeing past the blood and the bruises, seeing the cowardly, pathetic soul beneath the expensive facade. She remembered the nights she had cried on the freezing bathroom floor, the times he had locked her away for speaking out of turn, the countless moments he had made her feel absolutely invisible. "I do know you, Richard," Meline said, her voice echoing through the silent, frozen slaughterhouse with a haunting, crystal-clear purity. "I know exactly what you are." Richard stared at her, the final, devastating realization crashing down upon him as he saw the cold, unapologetic power radiating from her fragile frame. He finally understood that he had not been outsmarted by a rival syndicate or caught by federal agents. He had been completely and utterly dismantled by the wife he had treated like a broken, useless doll. Volkov laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the rusted meat hooks hanging from the ceiling. "A beautiful, dangerous game, Costa," the Russian noted, his eyes flicking approvingly toward Meline. "The money is returned. The debt is settled." Volkov turned his back on them, looking down at Richard with eyes that promised a slow, agonizing death. You are free to leave, Volkov told Gabriel. I have a very long night ahead of me with our mutual friend. Gabriel wrapped his arm tighter around Meline, pulling her flush against his solid, protected chest. He did not say another word as he turned her gently away from the kneeling, sobbing billionaire, guiding his queen out of the slaughterhouse and into the unforgiving dark. The freezing, metallic echo of the abandoned meat-packing plant seemed to stretch into a suffocating eternity as Gabriel gently guided Meline toward the heavy steel exit doors, his thick, fiercely protective arm wrapped possessively around her waist. Every step she took in her delicate black heels sounded like a final, ringing gavel strike against the blood-stained concrete floor. Behind them, the desperate, gargling sobs of Richard Sterling bounced off the rusted industrial chains and the cold, damp walls. Meline, please, Richard screamed, his voice shattering into a pathetic, high-pitched whine of pure, unadulterated terror as Alexei Volkov's ruthless Russian mercenaries circled him like starving wolves. You cannot leave me here with them. They are going to kill me. I gave you everything. I gave you a beautiful life. I am your husband. You owe me. Meline stopped walking. The air in her lungs felt suddenly completely clear, completely devoid of the suffocating panic that had dictated her every waking breath for 3 agonizing years. Gabriel paused instantly beside her, his massive, tailored frame acting as a silent, lethal shield, his thumb stroking a slow, grounding circle against her hip as he waited for her command. Slowly, Meline turned her head, her hazel eyes completely empty of the terror and submission Richard had so meticulously beaten into her. She looked at the bruised, kneeling billionaire, seeing the absolute, pathetic cowardice leaking from his pores. He was no longer a towering, untouchable titan of industry. He was just a small, broken man, drowning in a puddle of his own making. I owed you my loyalty, Richard, Meline said, her voice dropping into a deadly, crystalline whisper that sliced perfectly through the freezing, rancid air of the kill floor. And you repaid it by fracturing my ribs, isolating me from the world, and locking me inside a pristine glass cage. You spent years trying to break me into a quiet, obedient victim. But you failed. You built a survivor, Richard. You built a monster. Now, you get to die by her hand. She did not wait to see the final, crushing realization dawn on his bloody, swollen face. She did not flinch when Volkov let out a dark, approving laugh that echoed through the shadows. Meline simply turned her back on her abuser forever, leaning her slight, exhausted weight against Gabriel as he pushed. The heavy iron doors open. They stepped out into the biting, salty wind of the Brooklyn harbor, the pale, bruised light of early dawn just beginning to bleed across the cloudy, unforgiving skyline. Matteo was waiting by the sleek, armored black SUV, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter before he held the rear door open with a deep, intensely respectful nod meant only for a syndicate leader's equal. As Meline slid into the plush, heated leather interior, the agonizing, muffled sounds of Richard's final screams were abruptly and completely severed by the heavy slam of the bulletproof car door. Gabriel climbed in beside her, his large body instantly warming the enclosed space, filling the quiet, secure cabin with his intoxicating scent of dark cedar, roasted espresso, and lingering gunpowder. He reached out, his calloused, heavily tattooed fingers gently tracing the fading purple bruises along her delicate, pale jawline. You are trembling, Mia Regina, Gabriel murmured softly, his abyssal, predatory eyes searching hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion that made her heart race. Are you afraid of what we have done? Meline looked up at the fearsome Mafia boss, the ruthless apex predator who had happily burned down an entire empire and orchestrated a masterpiece of ruin just to watch her smile. She rested her small, uninjured hand over his large, scarred knuckles, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his pulse beneath his warm skin. She had spent her entire adult life terrified of the dark, but looking at Gabriel, she finally realized that the dark was the only place where she was truly protected. No, Meline answered, a genuine, breathtaking smile finally touching her lips as she leaned into his calloused palm. For the first time in my entire life, Gabriel, I feel completely safe. He let out a low, rough exhale, pulling her securely into his lap and burying his face in the soft curve of her neck as the armored convoy sped away from the harbor, carrying them toward a sprawling, heavily guarded estate where she would no longer be a prisoner, but a revered, untouchable queen. She had traded a pristine, suffocating heaven for a beautiful, violent hell, and as his strong arms wrapped around her, she knew she would never look back. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story here on Sunni Romance. What did you think of Meline's final, ruthless revenge against Richard? Did he deserve his brutal fate in the slaughterhouse? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and please do not forget to like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you never miss another thrilling, dark romance. Until next time, stay safe and keep reading.